talk about PHP 7, shall we? Because it's been a few months since it's released, and I realized that we haven't actually done a talk on PHP 7 yet at the PHP meetup, so I figured I'll do one just for the sake of completeness. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kat. I'm a software developer. I used to write mostly PHP, now I sort of do half PHP, half Go, or mostly Go these days, but I work for Brightfall. I was previously working for Buffer, and before then for Brightfall as well, so I'm kind of back at my own company now. And yeah, my Twitter handle, for those of you interested. So, PHP 7. PHP 5 was released 11 years ago. It's kind of shocking to find that out, but yeah, here we go. 7 was released last year in December, so it's been, what, 6 months now, half a year. Currently at 7.07. I wrote these slides on like 28th of April or something, and like the next day they released a new one. So I think since the 7.00 was released, there was a new like point release every month roughly. So they're pretty good at sort of keeping it up to date. So yeah, 7.07 is the current stable version. Yeah, probably some of you noticed we've gone from 5 to 7. For those of you who don't know the story of what happened with PHP 6, here is a short intro. Basically, the long story short is that PHP 5 ended up being PHP 6 minus all the Unicode stuff, which is why the PHP 6 project started originally. So back in 2005, a new PHP version project was started to bring native Unicode support to PHP, because that was a long-standing request. After 5 years of work, it was officially abandoned in 2010. The two biggest reasons for that they gave was a shortage of developers who actually knew the intricacies of Unicode well enough to keep working on it, and who kind of had the willingness to keep working on it after 5 years of work already. And the choice of UTF-8 16 as opposed to UTF-8, which would have been better for like web-based languages. There is a really good presentation, a link here in the postmortem, really good presentation about the guy who originally led the project, about like explaining what went wrong, what went well, and kind of doing an analysis of that. And then before the project was officially declared dead, because it was causing delays, because essentially like no new PHP versions were released, because they were saying like, oh, we're going to release it at 6. In the end, in 2009, it was decided to cut PHP 5.3. And then some of the known Unicode features that were ready at the time were ported back into 5.3, so namely namespaces was the big one. And then after PHP 6 was officially declared dead, 5.4 was cut, and then pretty much everything other than the Unicode thing went in, so things like traits. And that's why those two PHP releases actually brought in a lot of new stuff. And then recently, well, sort of before PHP 7 name was officially decided, there was a huge debate about it. You can see the official RFC, because that included an official RFC and a vote. The RFC lists all the pros and cons and arguments for should we call it PHP 6, should we not. The gist of it is that in sort of developers who knew about PHP 6, in their head PHP 6 was a release of PHP, even though probably most developers had no idea that PHP 6 was even a thing once upon a time. And apparently there were some books written and blog posts written that already started referencing PHP 6, so if the new version was also called PHP 6, that could cause some confusion. So in the end, yeah, surprise, surprise, 7.1. We have enough integers, so we should. So it's not uncommon for like software in the software world to like skip versions. So yeah, all we have after 6 now is just funny stickers like the certified PHP 6 engineer. Yeah, so let's talk about PHP 7. Basically, the rest of the presentation is going to be about what's new, what's going to break, and how do you get it. Apologies for those of you who already know most of this stuff. This is like, I tried to do a fairly thorough run through. I'm going to skip some of this stuff because it's just like, I don't want to go into too much detail, it's just too much. There's a lot of new things. So yeah, hopefully even for those of you who have played with PHP 7 already, there might be a thing or two that you didn't realize was in there. So, let's start with the most important one, which is speed. That is a big reason to upgrade. Even before 7 was released, but like after 7 was released, Zend did some testing. So I basically taken their test, because they are most commonly quoted on the web as like the most reliable test for how efficient PHP 7 is. This compares 5.6, HHVM, and PHP 7. So starting with Magento, turns out Magento over 2 times faster, using 30% less of memory compared to 5.6, which essentially means that on the same hardware you can serve more requests, serve more customers, which means savings, especially for like smaller companies who can't necessarily afford, you know, a giant AWS cloud or something. So yeah, Magento seems to be more than 2 times fast. Drupal 8, 72% faster, which is incredible compared to 5.6. Laravel 60% faster. This is like, by the way, the y-axis is requests per second. So you can see that Laravel and PHP 7 can serve almost twice as many requests as on 5.6, and that's just by upgrading, doing nothing to the code. Zen Framework 2 over 95% faster. There is a reason for that. I'll touch on that later. Compared to 5.6, so yeah, huge gains in speed. WordPress just screams on 5.7. It used to, on 5.6, it used to do over, just under, I think it was like 96 billion CPU instructions, and then on PHP 7 it only needs to do 25 billion, which is just an incredible speed gain. So again, for those of you running WordPress websites, just by upgrading, you're going to serve like so many more requests, more than double the requests. At least in theory, but these tests are taught to be reliably good. And then sort of comparison of between languages. The Mandelbrot fractal is basically a complicated math function that, like, if you plot it on the screen, it just produces pretty patterns. PHP 7 turns out to be the fastest. I think Python, like here they're comparing to Python 2.7. I think the latest one, there's already a 3 out, so might not be fair, but still, it's probably either as fast as the new Python or still faster. So yeah, looking good compared to Ruby, Perl, Python. So where does this come from? Why is it so much faster? So a bit of a background. So PHP 7 started from a branch that was dubbed PHP Next Generation, so PHPNG. It was basically aimed to optimize performance by completely refactoring the Zen engine that was PHP was using. And then there were so many changes that actually decided to call it Zen Engine 3 for PHP 7, as opposed to 2, which is used in PHP 5. I didn't know that as well, but like turns out even Intel's like performance team collaborated with Zen on the Zen engine. And so there is this blog post explains, kind of from a guy from Intel, explains which types of processors might be better to run PHP 7 on, because apparently even Intel kind of accommodated for that. And that probably explains why for the Zen framework we've seen like the biggest gains for PHP 7. Yeah, because of the completely new engine inside it. So, what other new things are coming with PHP 7? There was a pretty major overhaul of errors in PHP. Before PHP 7, it used to be that many things that went wrong, they would throw a fatal error, and there was no way for you to catch it. It would just crap out, blow up on the screen. PHP 7, most, if not all of them, are now catchable errors. There was a bit of a difference between the original PHP 7 RFC, had a bit of a different idea for the new error structure. There was something called engine exception in the original proposal. That then, I think in 7.01 was changed to the error class. So the new types of exceptions that are thrown instead of the fatals are still exceptions, but they don't extend the exception class. They extend the error class. So think of error as an exception, but not the actual exception class. That was done to prevent if your code was doing the catch-all, exception E somewhere in your framework or at the top level. That was basically done for backwards compatibility reasons to prevent you now accidentally catching all of the fatals. And then there was a new throwable interface that both exception and error implement now. So for the catch-all statement, you should be using throwable now as an interface. And just like before, if you don't catch these, they will throw a fatal error. So you can just blow up if you want to, or you can catch them and handle some of them if you want to. So here's the new structure and a nice tree. So the throwable interface at the top, there's the exception class, and that's just all as it was before. And then the error class, which also implements the throwable, and a bunch of new error classes, which are basically the exceptions that are thrown for specific things. So there's a type error, parse error, arithmetic error, division by zero error, and assertion error. Here's an explanation of what everything is. Division by zero is obvious, so I didn't put that in. So type error is when you're using type declarations, when you're trying to pass something that isn't the right type, and you're using the strict mode, because by default, type declaration is the sort of soft mode, so it's not strictly enforced. Parse error is just mostly syntax errors. Arithmetic error is mostly for negative bit shift, and I think some other bit shifting operations, some of them. And then assertion error is when you're using assert as a function, and when it's not met, it will just throw an error exception instead. So those names, so throwable error, type error, and parse error are now reserved words. So you can't create classes like that anymore, so watch out for that. If you, like, some projects might have their own like implementation of the exception called error, so that's not going to work. You can namespace that, and that should work, so there is a workaround. Yeah, like I said, catch-all blocks should now catch the throwable interface. There is a presentation in here, there's more on errors, there's like it has a whole explanation of exactly when each error is thrown, and like depending on what you do. So that's the errors. One of the big new things is the scalar type hints. So yeah, you can now type hint. By default, it's not strict. So PHP. So what that means is if you're in, I don't know, if you're saying that this function should accept an integer and you will pass in a float instead, PHP will cast that to an integer for you, or the other way around. So PHP will try and cast. Unless you use this declaration called declares strict types at the top, it has to be right at the top, and it will apply to the file that it's declared in. So it doesn't. So it's not enough to put this like at the top level PHP file, and then it doesn't mean that it will apply to everything else. It will just apply to the file that you're working in. So for any function calls in that file and any return statements in that file. And then if you declare the strict type, and if you have a mismatch, then you will have the error thrown. Otherwise, PHP will just cast things for you. And then similarly, so this was about the arguments. You can specify the type of the argument, and also you can specify the type of the return. The syntax is basically double colon, the name of the type that you expect. Oh yeah, so actually the type hints and the return types, that's only for scalar types. So integers, floats, strings, and booleans, at least for now. And then, yeah, a couple of details. So return types may be omitted unless you're extending from a class that does explicitly declare the return type. If you don't use this, it's completely fine. Nothing will break. And yeah, the exception is that constructors, destructors, and clone methods cannot declare return types, because obviously that construct will give you an object, so it's not a scalar type. A new operator in town called the spaceship operator, which is, you might be familiar with this from the other languages. The official name is combined comparison operator. It's basically a shortcut for if you're comparing two things and you have the spaceship operator in between. It will return 0 if they are equal, it will return -1 if the left one is greater, and -1 if the right one is greater. So it's basically a shortcut for what we used to do. Here's an example at the bottom. We used to have these like long statements for the ternary operator. So like if this is, if this is true, return -1. It's basically a shortcut for that. Nothing complicated. So yeah, saves you some characters. And it can be used on like strings, integers, floats, pretty much all the basic types. Another new thing is the null coalesce operator, so the double question mark signs. And that's basically checking for if something is set before returning that. Otherwise, it returns whatever you specify on the right. So here in the example, if you want the username to be set to either the get user if it's set, or nobody if get user is not set. So it's basically a shortcut for that. They can be changed as well. So kind of the example at the bottom, it will check if X is set, get X, otherwise go to Y. If Y is set Y is obviously null, it will go to Z, and then it will output 3. So you can chain them. Probably not recommended for complicated things, same as ternary operators. Another new thing, this CSPRNG, that's basically a different way to generate crypto strong random integers, and that uses the operating system's random number generator rather than the sort of built-in PHP random number generator. So that's where that's useful. Like, it's probably not the most used feature of PHP, but like if you're, I don't know, generating password salts yourself or anything to do with cryptographic functions, that's basically more secure, way more secure than the built-in random function in PHP. And then if for some reason that gets hacked, we have bigger problems because that means your OS has been hacked, not just PHP. So yeah, basically more secure cryptographic random integer generation. Another fun thing was Unicode support. So there's a new escape character /u, and then you give it a hex number of the Unicode character that you want. So things like /u, whatever outputs, whatever emoji. And one thing to watch out for, which I'll mention at the end as well, is that if your code or if your string will include just /u for whatever reason, your string just has a /u and curly brackets, and you don't pass in the hex code, it will throw an error or warning because you'll now treat that. So you have to escape the / if you don't want this to act as a Unicode interpreter. There were a bunch of inconsistency fixes, which was quite good to see. So needle haystack has not been fixed, but, and this is kind of not a very user-facing feature, but it is a really good thing for PHP itself. So we now have an abstract syntax tree which is built between the parsing phase and the compiling phase. And that itself doesn't really do much other than it paves way for a lot more cleanups to be made. So this is a quote from the IRC that basically, that's the main reason for introducing that. So pave the way to remove a number of hacks and make the implementation more maintainable and understandable in general. That's for PHP source code itself, not for your code. But because basically there were a lot of hacks that had to be put in the PHP code itself because for like just purely technological reasons or implementation reasons, there was no reason for those inconsistencies in theory. So basically introducing that allows the PHP internals team to just clean that up and not have funny things anymore. And then sort of stemming from that on, there were a couple of other inconsistency things fixed. For example, how the expressions are evaluated. That was a bit inconsistent, that in theory it's left to right, but some of the functions in that was quite a lot of functions would do like right to left, for example. So now we have, this is kind of like coming out of that particular RC. So we have the ... operator now, which just allows you to sort of pass in arbitrary expressions. Again, that's kind of exists in other languages already, so PHP is kind of catching up on that. And then ability to call closures using sort of that sort of syntax if you're using closures. And then you can chain static calls as well. So yeah, you can do foobar and then ... baz or chain. So first do the static call and then do a function of that. Like, I haven't really seen a real life example of that because that looks to me like messy code, but in theory you can do that now. So that's an interesting one because this is a big change because now all of the statements that are on the left will be interpreted with left to right as opposed to most of them right to left. So for example, in the first case, normally you would expect PHP, so pre 5.7, the 3 lines at the bottom match the 3 lines at the top. That's how they would be interpreted with if you put brackets around them. So in the first case, you'd first evaluate the foobar baz and then take that and do the $$ on that. Whereas now it's going to be left to right, so you're first going to do $$ foo, then go to bar and then go to baz. So basically just strictly left to right. And same with the second example. In like pre-PHP 5.7, you do foo and then bar and baz inside, and then call the function. Whereas PHP 7 will do foo bar first, then baz, and then the function. And in the last case, a PHP like 5 would do first var baz, then foo static call, and then the function. And then PHP 7 would just do left to right, so foo static call to var, then from that buzz, and then from that the function. This is backwards. So this is in theory backwards incompatible, but you can recreate the old behavior by doing the curly brackets around it to force it to interpret it the way you want it. Otherwise, the default is now left to right, which is nice and consistent. So there's a change to there's a new function for closures called call, which basically allows you to pass in the object and then pass in any argument to pass into the closure. So here's a very short example. If you have a class called hello world with private greeting, a hello variable, and then you define your closure as a function where you pass in an argument, whom you could optionally put a string in there as the type declaration, and then you echo this greeting and then append the whom. Then if you create your object of hello world and you do closure call on that object with word, it's basically just a nice clean way of calling that closure with that argument. So yeah, if you're using closures, that's probably quite handy. This is just a sort of just the presentation layer. If you're using declarations, used to be quite tedious if you had a lot of declarations from the same name, starting with the same namespace, and then just like different sub namespaces. You can do something like that now. So you can do use framework component and then just list only the varying part of the namespace. So it just saves you a bit of typing, I guess. That's an interesting one as well. So generators got a bit of an overhaul. They can now return a value once they're done generating. So with the caveat that if they haven't returned, or if the generator itself returned an error, then when you call the generator get the return value, that will throw an exception. If there is no return value specified, so again for backwards compatibility, nothing is returned. Everything works as before. So that's a short example. If you have foo, which yields 1, 2, and then return 42, and then return 42 is the new addition. If you call that, and then at the end you call get return on the generator, then the output will be 1 and 2, which is the 2 yield statements, and then the return value. So you can explicitly get that once the generator is done generating. And then that's another addition to generators. So you can one generator can return another iterable structure, so say another generator. The important thing to sort of keep in mind is that it's still done in a sort of flat structure way, so it's not a recursive call. So there's going to be nothing crazy going on, like if your generator returns another one, then it's not going to be like the inner one is first and then the outer one is first, nothing like that. It will just go sequentially in the outer generator, and then once it hits the new generator, it will go through that one. So it's fairly like sequential, no recursion. And that's an example. That's kind of applicable to arrays mostly. So if you have G is the generator, yields 1, and then yields from an array, and 5, then you'll basically go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So very sequential from the first one to the second one, go through the inner one, and then go back to the outer one. So yeah, pretty cool. And then, so those are like the new things that are coming out. There are quite a lot of things that might break your code, but most of the things have been handled pretty nicely, and most of them have workarounds, so not that scary. Here's a list of the deprecated things. So not removed yet, but strongly discouraged to use PHP 4 style constructors, which are methods with the same name as the class method. So this is what PHP used to do before we had the construct method. Static calls to methods that are not declared static are now deprecated. The password hash salt option is deprecated, basically to stop people from generating their own salts. The function itself will generate a cryptographically secure salt when you don't provide one, so just better leave it up to PHP. And then the SSL context option captured session meta. Yeah, there is an alternative that you should use. So now there's a whole load of things that have been removed. There was a whole RFC about things that should be removed, because basically the changes that were initially done to the Zend engine kind of people knew that it's likely that PHP 7 will not be backwards compatible. So then it was decided that actually we might use that as an opportunity to just clean up a whole load of things, because we're going to break things anyway. Like, we're going to break backwards compatibility with that release anyway. So hence, a lot of things got removed. Mostly, so the first thing was remove all the deprecated things. So basically everything that's been deprecated since like PHP 5.3 just got slashed and killed. So I don't know if there's anybody using still the MySQL extension. That got removed, so you need to switch to PDO or MySQLi. Same with the ereg extension. Use PCRE instead. Those were like 5.3, and then MySQL was deprecated since 5.5, but yeah, a long time ago anyway. There were a bunch of other extensions and server APIs that were removed, so for a whole list, there's a link in there. Assignment of new by reference, that was deprecated since 5.3. Just use normal assignments, don't use that. So all of these will now just throw fatal errors, not just warning anymore. And then the official name for this is scoped calls of non-static methods from incompatible this context. What that basically means is if you call a function that is not static in a static way from this, that will now return. So now it will then cause this to be undefined, and you will get a deprecated warning instead as well. A whole bunch of deprecated functions. None of these seem very common. So things like magic quotes or a bunch of encrypt functions. But yeah, if your framework happens to use one of these, there are alternatives for most of these. So just it doesn't mean completely removing it from your code. It just means switching to newer versions most of the time. More deprecated things. A bunch of ini options from the PHP ini file is deprecated. There are alternatives for most of these. For make time and GMMK time is DST parameter was removed. I don't think that's very common, but hey. Hashtag style comments in the ini files are no longer supported, so just use the normal comments for ini files. String category names in the setLocale function was removed. Unsafe curl file uploads were removed. That's an interesting one. And so yeah, use curl file instead. A bunch of other changes like preg replace, and then a bunch of PDO constants. So yeah, these are not sort of as common, but I thought I'll list them anyway. So there were all the changes to error and exception handling I already mentioned, so that might break your code, so just watch out for those. And then yeah, expressions evaluated left to right. Also interesting that you can't use those variables, so double dollar style variables, with the global keyword unless you put the curly braces in, and that forces it to switch to the old way of doing things. So if you just do global double dollar foo bar, that's just not going to work. You should put the curly braces around after the first dollar if you want to make it work. Changes to the list function. It no longer assigns variables in the reverse order if you use it with an array. So there's a list, an example at the bottom. It basically just calls list AAA, so 3 elements of an array, and you pass in an array with 1, 2, 3. Pre-PHP 7 would do it the other way around, so what you'd get in return is 3 to 1 for some reason, inconsistency. And then the PHP 7 has this fixed, so it'll just actually do what's expected, so it'll produce a 1, 2, 3 array, which is nice. Changes for each. The first point is interesting. I ran into this like once a while ago, and this is one of those like really obscure things that you'll run into like once every few years, and then you'll spend half a day working out why is it not working. So basically, for each, the important change is that for each will no longer move the internal array pointer if you're iterating through an array. So when you're passing by reference, that's the important bit. So there's a short example in here. If you iterate through the array with 1, 2, 3 by reference, so you do the and sign value, and then if you try and var dump the current internal pointer value of the array, then in PHP 5, because the for each would loop once, so the pointer will be moved to the first element. So remembering that arrays are indexed from 0. The first element is 1, and then as you loop in, it will do 2, and then the pointer will be moved to the end of the array, so it will output false, which could trip some people up, because if you just basically if you loop through for each with the pass by reference, and you just happen to use current inside, it will just go one more than you would expect. In PHP 7, the internal pointer for the array is not moved at all. So you basically iterate through the values, but then the pointer stays at the first element, unless you explicitly tell it to go to the next element with the next, like call to next, and then you pass in the array. So they are completely separate. It's not that common, but once you run into this, it's hell. For each, if you do for each by value, now it operates on the copy of the array, so it's not going to affect the original array that you pass in. And then if you pass in for each by reference, it has a slightly improved, like slightly more as expected behavior. So if you're iterating through an array and you pass it by reference, and then you add stuff to it in your for each loop, it will actually take that into account in the for each loop itself, rather than just ignoring it. So don't have an example in there, but basically if you had an array with 3 elements and at some point in the for each you will add a 4th element, it would still iterate through 3 elements in PHP 5, whereas PHP 7 will kind of update the for each loop as you go. So it's kind of a bit more as expected behavior. Some changes to integer handling. If you try and do bitwise shifts by negative numbers, you'll get the arithmetic errors. Division by 0 will throw a division by 0 error, not just a fatal. Some changes to string handling. Hexadecimal strings are no longer considered numeric. So yeah, that's just like if you're sort of juggling between the hex values and hex values as a string and then integers, and you're just kind of hoping that PHP will cast that, it will no longer happen. And this is the thing that I mentioned about the Unicode. So if you have a /u curly bracket that is not intended to be a Unicode sign, you need to escape the /. So, more things. New objects. So yeah, you cannot create new objects by reference with the new keyword. The ASP and PHP script tags have been removed. So if you were doing the less than sign and the %, or script language PHP, this is really old school sort of way of declaring PHP files. That no longer works. Again, about the static method, so if you're trying to call a non-static function statically, it will throw an error. Yield no longer needs parentheses, and then it kind of, again, it's just improving the consistency. It will take the rightmost parameter and then sort of implicitly treat this as like this is meant to be passed into yield, as opposed to leave it at the end. So if you had a statement echo yield -1, previously you would do echo yield with nothing and then do -1. Now you don't need the parentheses, but it will basically echo whatever yield -1 produces. So do yield -1 first and then echo that. Functions cannot have multiple parameters with the same name. So this is input parameters, you can't have 2 with the same name anymore. Switch statements cannot have multiple default blocks. Again, I've never seen this, but if you had more than one, it's not going to work anymore. The HTTP row post data is no longer available, so PHP is going back to the PHP /input again, so just use that. And then there was a bunch of new reserved keywords added, so bool, integer, float, string, null, true, and false can no longer be used as class names. And then resource, object, mixed, and numeric have not been reserved yet, but they will be reserved in the future, so they're deprecated for now. So avoid using those instead as your class names. For all of that, there are some tools that will help you work out if you are breaking PHP 7 rules or not. If you're using PHP Storm, there is a built-in, in the 2016 edition, there is a built-in compatibility check. So you just go code run inspection by name, PHP 7 compatibility, it will tell you what's wrong. There is also a PHP 7 compatibility checker on GitHub. It's like a command line tool that you pull in via Composer that will basically tell you if your code is compliant with PHP 7 or not, or if it uses anything that has been removed. So yeah, that's nice and easy. And then the last thing is, how can you get PHP 7? If you want a Vagrant box with PHP 7, Rasmus has prepared a nice and shiny Vagrant file for you, so you can just get it from GitHub. That's good for if you want to just get a VM with PHP 7, run your tests on it, run your code, test your code, very handy. And then you can download the binaries from the official PHP 7 website, or you can use the package managers. I think most of them now have PHP 7 available. Basically Google, because like DigitalOcean has instructions for most of the operating systems. So the example of how to upgrade to PHP 7 on Ubuntu, there is one for everyone, so just Google around. So yeah, that's it. If you have any questions, then yeah, fire them. And I think that is it. So yeah, if you have any questions, fire them. I'll try and answer. Otherwise, thank you for listening to my rambling.
Why should people upgrade?
Speed, in my opinion, speed. Because it's basically, it's worth the hassle of going and removing the few deprecated things that you're going to have in your code. But yeah, you just get the speed for free with very few changes, most likely. So I would say that. Especially, like, I'm hoping that the huge speed gains will encourage people who run something on a tiny amount of servers, and they are kind of trying to squeeze out as much as they can from their limited amount of servers. That's basically where this is very helpful for you. If you can just throw money at hardware, I guess you can wait a bit longer. Yeah. Anything else? Or?
Well, thanks very much.